Welcome back to Made to Walk. Today we are going to be diving into the discussion on emergency relief work, specifically with natural disasters. So, I wanted to touch on what some of these things might cover. We would be focusing in on the discussion in relations to things like fires, hurricanes, floods. These are natural disasters and man made disasters, so tornadoes and so on and so forth. There's four stages of the relief that you have to take into consideration. There is immediate recovery, the cleaning recovery, advocacy, and your needs assessment. In the immediate recovery, we want to be focusing on clearing the area, securing the area so that new people can't come into the area, either from just being a looky-loo, a reporter, but also looters and people who might be coming back into the area if they weren't in the area to begin with to look for lost pets, lost belongings, or simply to look for someone that they love. The second aspect of this immediate recovery within the first few hours is also once we've cleared and the environment has been in some way managed, the areas that are managed are under control. You start to enter buildings once they are deemed to be safe to enter and identify that there's nobody trapped inside, and that there's no bodies left behind as well. In the cleaning recovery stage, we are focused on both identifying photographs from prior to the devastation and also photographing things immediately following the devastation. The reason why we do this is because, let's just say, for example, you have a tornado and that tornado ripped off the roof of a home and they did not immediately photograph and tarp the damage that had been significantly harm to their home. And then hypothetically, it rained 2 days later. Insurance companies can get very fickle about what they're cover in relations to the tornado damage versus rain damage because the house wasn't tarped. So if you're thinking about doing recovery work, being able to get in, clean, secure, photograph, and tarp are the main things that need to be done uh, immediately following a devastation. Advocacy happens the most critically between the 6-month mark and the 2-year mark. Now, I want to be really clear in the aspect of communicating this. I think it's important for churches to be on the ground immediately. It also can be very helpful if churches start to call their membership lists. I talked to someone who had a foundational church that was in the middle of a devastation. And he said that they just started to call members one by one down the list and just make sure that they were not either currently missing or that they hadn't been harmed in any way from what had occurred. So that can be helpful in the first few hours to the first few days. The second part is the advocacy and counseling that is provided between the 6-month mark or prior, and especially the 6-month mark to the 2-year mark, when most nonprofits and governmental services have been removed from the area. We know that there is an increase in mental health issues, and we'll talk about that if they do not get the advocacy or counseling efforts that are needed. Needs assessment, I think, is where most people feel the most comfortable to participate in when it comes to relief work. And that's mostly you're going to be your donations. But what I want to hyper focus in on is being able to identify a resource list that is going to be helpful and realistic. Most people immediately start to go and pull together used clothes, canned goods, and so on and so forth. The problem with having these big bulks of drop off of essentially things that can even be, I would say, lean towards trash at times is that it takes up facility space. So we need to make sure that what we're donating is proper. If you're going to be collecting cans as a church, make sure that you go through them before dropping them off and make sure none of them are expired. That will save the on-ground team a great deal of time in their distribution process, that you're not handing out expired food. Two, if they're going to get canned foods, either also participate in receiving can openers, hand can openers to actually open the cans, or two, that they choose cans that have that pull top lid on it, okay? Because we want to be realistic that if there has been home damage or even flooding, they're not able to use their stove. They probably can't find a can opener. And so they need to be able to eat things that don't necessarily need heating, and don't necessarily need a can opener. So when you start to think about these resources, think about it as a whole, and not just, oh, that sounds like a good idea, let's collect a bunch of that, because it will eat you up time. Also, take into consideration the upcoming weather. So most people focus on whatever the weather is right now, the day that it happened, and blankets can be very helpful if it's cold immediately. But long term, you're not going to want to continue to collect blankets, especially, let's just say hypothetically this happens in May. You really want to start thinking about collecting fans and start collecting things for cooling, actual coolers where people can put drinks and ice if they are still unable to use their kitchen resources, things to that regard, because you always want to think forward where they're going to need over the next few months instead of just the next few hours. When you are thinking about the resource tiers, in this particular category, you think of food, clothing, household products, and we don't want to forget our pet resources. So, under food, we talked about identifying expiration dates and categorizing. These can be very helpful, especially if you can categorize them by baby foods, snacks, necessary proteins, and so on and so forth. Clothing, I like to divide these by age demographic and seasonal. So, for example, I have shelves that have labels on the boxes that will say men's boots, or women's sandals, uh, children's flip flops, things to that regard, because it's a lot easier than trying to break them up by size, because those resources go so quickly. If you have them broken up by girl and boy, male and female, then it just helps to be able to do that. When you have bulk shoes that kind of are, could be any category, they're just your average everyday shoes, you can break them down by size. Women's, um, if you have more space, you'd say women's, size 9 or whatever it may be. But I like to be, in big categories, because it's just too time consuming to sit there and try to find the sizes of everything. So women's boots, and I can even do teens if it is a young adult, but older than a child, that kind of thing. It will just help your resource teams to be able to move quicker. Household products, so things to be able to clean. Flood buckets are really helpful, but trash bags, Tupperware, just boxes, the simple things of them being able to collect their resources that they have left behind and hold on to them, because they may not be able to leave them there on the premise. So it's a matter of being able to clean them off and put them in a nice box where they can either move to a storage or a separate area. Our pet resources, that can be pet beds, pet foods. Again, look for expiration dates, leashes, collars, etc. Think of all kinds of animals, and you would be able to donate those in the same areas as well. Let's talk about the stages of mental concern, because this is our main focus on advocacy, especially in nonprofit work, is we think about when to get involved, how to get involved. And so if you're looking at the stage specific to advocacy, this is what would be helpful for you to understand. 23% of an increase in suicidal harm occurs when someone does not receive advocacy or counseling within the first 6 months of a crisis. 20 to 40% of people in disaster affected areas experience some form of psychological distress. And so PTSD, anxiety disorders, and other health concerns and conditions can start to take over the body with trying to respond to the trauma that they're experiencing, especially when not receiving any kind of care. A couple of just examples that we can take a look at together, Hurricane Katrina had a 49.1% reported probable mental illness a year after the disaster, and the suicide rates doubled in New Orleans within 2 years. And so you can see that 6 month to 2 year time period is very vital on being able to be there, because again, most governmental resources and nonprofits alleviate from the zone within 6 months. So, how do we respond with care, especially when we are a Christian based organization? Times we can say things that feel like, oh, is that the right thing to say, the wrong thing to say? Is that helpful or unhelpful? We're going to talk about some of the things you should and shouldn't touch on. So we want to avoid spiritual cliches, or what is called toxic positivity. And I know that sounds very intense, but when you say things like everything happens for a reason, or let's go get your mind off of things, especially if someone has lost a loved one in the disaster or even a pet, it can be very dismissive to try to move them on with what we would consider to be cultural joy. If you just think positive and just know God sits on the throne, like everything will be fine. These things are true and they are good and they are important, but they do not process trauma. So these two things have to coexist. Two things can be true. God can absolutely have a plan and a purpose for everything that a person has to experience, but also they may be experiencing fight or flight, PTSD, nightmares, hallucinations, all kinds of other things that do need specific care that cannot be dismissed with a simple statement. Focus on presence over answers. So we want to listen deeply and pray gently and create space for lament. And if you want to know more about that, what the process looks like, we'll touch on it here in just a moment. So isolation worsens trauma. Community helps to isolation worsens trauma. Community helps reestablish safety and identity. So we have to pay attention if people start to pull back from posting on social media, if they start to isolate, withdraw, not come to church. And even if it's, well, we've got a lot going on, we're still working on the house. We're having issues, since we don't have a car. These simple statements can have very real realities and truths for them in the short term. But when you start to hear them in the long term, you realize that they have gotten so disconnected because of their situation that it has become isolation, which can be very unhealthy. And so when you have small children who have experienced the trauma as well, it's very important to establish safe routines, even simple ones, with children to reset that structure. And so if you can start to think about, I know that your life is chaotic, I know that there's a lot going on, but what are things that you can do to reset your morning routine, or try to create a pattern so that children can know what to expect instead of living in a state of, I don't know what's going to happen today. When we're talking about lament, it's a beautiful process and it is very clearly identified in scripture. Um, and it's a simple process, it's an honest process. And so when people lament to others, we want to be very gracious with accepting whatever it is that they are feeling and they are vocalizing, much like you see oftentimes in Psalms, Lamentations, and in scripture, through David's words, Solomon's words, and so on and so forth, because it does take honesty to talk about the pain that you're experiencing instead of, oh, we're doing okay, we're doing fine, thanks for asking, moving on past that. So you're saying your statement honestly before God or your community. You're naming that pain, and then it's a little faith intention. So lament isn't a lack of faith. It's a faith in the middle of the storm. So if there's a question in there, God, why have you allowed this? God, why, why today, whatever it may be, why him and not me, those questions, it's not a faithless question. And oftentimes Christians will rebuke that. Um, and that's not an accurate depiction of lament in the Bible. It's a full focus of being able to identify and feel deeply. And then there's a hopeful protest. So ending that with um, clearly identifying that God hears, cares, and will act towards your pain. God, I know you are good and you will not let evil reign over me. God, I know you sit on the throne and that I know that you will be victorious in the situation. Whatever it may be, you end on a hopeful, but it is completely safe and okay to allow someone to vocalize their despair fully and honestly and transparently without feeling as though they are being judged for that questioning or for that honesty, because we want to end with a hopeful protest. And you can see some of these just simple phrases, but they are deeply a formulation of honesty. In Psalms 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Lamentations, there's a whole book of grieving after Jerusalem's fall. And Jesus on the cross himself says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it is essentially a lament. And so even if it is finding words in the Bible that feel what you are feeling, and you are reciting that psalm or that verse, that proverb, that lamentation that you are meditating on to make yourself come to a hopeful protest, that is completely healthy if they don't have words themselves. Sometimes these experiences can leave people breathless, wordless, and hopeless. And so we give them words to be able to meditate on. So if you are a nonprofit or a church and you are thinking about, I think we would be really great in this stage of recovery. We'd love to help you, consult with you about developing that system more thoroughly for your region, depending on what natural disasters are more custom from where you are. We can also walk you through the stages of hours into days into months of where the church or nonprofit can be beneficial in helping um, in the resources ahead for these types of devastations. You can visit us at madetowalk.org to see some of our other trainings and to also be able to touch on some other crises. And want to thank you for this time that you've given to us. And we look forward to walking through more crisis situations with you together.